Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Super Feeler podcast. I'm Laurie, and I'm so happy to be joined by Dave and Megan. We're going to be doing more of our DBT for Life Skills series, DBT Skills Series, whatever we call it. It won't have felt like a long time for all of you because these episodes are coming out on like a regular basis, but I don't think we've met in 2 months, maybe, to record these. So it feels like it's been a million years. So anyways, just super stoked to see you both. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about emotion regulation. So if you're following along in the book, we're starting at page 145, which is unit 3. So we've already done the first two components of DBT, which is mindfulness and interpersonal effectiveness. And now we're in the emotion regulation section. Does anybody have any initial thoughts about emotion regulation that they wanted to share?
I feel like emotion regulation was one of the skills that I struggled with the most, but I also find to be probably one of the more important sections of DBT for me. And I find that I use these skills quite regularly, probably more so than some of the other skills that we've covered previously. So I'm really excited to chat about my lived experiences with them and kind of just get into it.
Amazing. Yeah, I love these skills, but I agree that they are harder than maybe they seem on the surface. Dave, how about you?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Megan said. I think that I liked the scale they have in here on page 146 about emotional set point. Thinking about where you are. I know, I'd never seen one quite like this before. The one that I've seen before, it's a 0 to 10, but it's like a distress tolerance scale where I guess 1 is you're fine and 10 is you need to be hospitalized, which I think assumes that there's just always some level of distress. And while that may be the case, I think that this, particularly for someone who's not just actively in need of real intervention to stay grounded, this seems like also a helpful way to look at it, where, obviously, 10 it says bliss and joy. And my guess is most people, even, people without any identifiable mental health issues, really don't find themselves in bliss and joy a lot unless they're using a lot of drugs or something. But I think it shows that it's all right to be at a place, number 7, where you're finding enjoyment, or 8, connected and content, while also recognizing that sometimes nothing's enjoyable, or you're struggling to get by, or you're just managing. So I appreciated this kind of scale.
Out of curiosity, where do you feel like you guys are, either now or when you were reading this originally?
I was looking at it today, and I think I'm at the number 7, finding enjoyment.
I think that's where I'm at too. Or connected and content. But what's funny is that when I originally read this, I was struggling to get by because I was reading this when I was in that treatment center and things were really bad. And so it's kind of nice also to even look at this and be like, okay, life does change, right? My emotional state went from 3 on this scale to a 6 or 7 or 8 within a couple of months, which is a nice reminder that these emotions pass. How do you feel you're at, Megan?
I think right now I'm probably at managing, to be honest. I've been quite busy with work, but something that I highlighted on this emotional set point diagram is that starting at a higher set point supports better resilience when bad things happen. And so that point is for the emotion regulation skills help us maintain a higher level of emotional functioning. And I found that really hit home because when I'm in a period of, especially I'm relating to it right now, where I'm really busy with work, things haven't been going super great, I've been really stressed, the resilience to deal with other things is lower because I'm already starting at kind of a lower set point. So I can really relate to this right now, and I find that it's a very interesting concept, and I agree with what Dave said, is I like seeing it framed in this way.
Yeah, it's much more strengths-based, right? Not just the goal is to literally survive. The goal is to have bliss and joy or feel happy and centered. And like, yes, it's going to go up and down on the scale over time, but like, at least we know that survival isn't our end goal, if that makes sense. I had another few thoughts on like even just the first page of this chapter, because I feel like Diana, who's the author of this book, did such a good job of explaining emotion regulation and like the fact that regulating our emotions to feel nothing is not the goal. So I just have a couple of lines I highlighted here. So, do your moods determine your behavior? The goal of emotion regulation skills is to reverse that relationship and have your behavior deriving your mood. She also talks about how emotional sensitivity can be measured scientifically by monitoring heart rate, levels of perspiration, and brain activity. And then she says, we're expected to travel through life surrounded by people who don't understand why everything is, quote unquote, such a big deal for us. But emotional sensitivity is also a superpower. DBT doesn't try and discourage or fix emotional sensitivity. Instead, it aims to provide the training needed to transform our emotions from a liability into a superpower. And I mean, that's the whole point of Superfeeler, right? The Superfeelers Club, Superfeeler podcast, like all of this stuff is about the fact that this is a superpower. But I do think that, you know, she says that the point of DBT isn't to fix our emotional sensitivity. I would argue that sometimes it feels that way when you're in DBT. And I love how she's framed this. It's amazing. This is why her and I connected. But did you guys feel that when you were actually going through the program that was the framing?
I think for me, and maybe it's a matter of semantics, but, you know, I think that there's a difference between trying to teach people to blunt their emotions versus really, I think what she's talking about here, which is, you know, living your emotions in a way that aligns with your values and also that doesn't interfere with your ability to act effectively towards your goals and values. And so, no, I mean, fortunately, my experience in DBT wasn't, you know, emotion regulation is here to just get you to like bring it down internally. But I think, you know, when done well by a skilled practitioner, it's really more about, just living more in line with your values. And, you know, and I think here, one thing that occurred to me is, you know, when they say the things like, you know, when people around us say things like, why are you overreacting? Why can't you just get over it? Why are you so sensitive? It occurs to me that what people there are reacting to, they're not really reacting to the emotion that I'm feeling. They're reacting to the way that the emotion is like coming out into the world. And so, you know, there are lots of people who, you know, probably care about me, who on the one hand are like, you know, it's okay for you to feel this thing, but also you're like flipping out at me at like a dinner party. And like, you know, so it's, I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I could see where someone might take that approach, and it hasn't been my experience with DBT.
Well, I'm glad that wasn't your experience. That's awesome. Like, I don't think it should be, right? But it's about being able to feel the emotion, but then not flip out at people, because that's not going to get you where you need to be. And I think that's the like almost like second stage of DBT, is like kind of seeing the like meta of it all and like how these things all connect. Megan, how about you?
I think I'm fairly similar to Dave in the way that like when I've gone through DBT, it hasn't necessarily felt that like I'm trying to diminish my emotions, like blunt or mute them. My experience has always very much been that like emotions aren't a bad thing. It's just there's a time and a place and like I don't want to say an appropriate response, but like there's a validity to certain responses that like if your dog dies, like there's going to be a heightened emotion there because like that that would make sense for anybody versus like my shopping cart getting stuck in the snow at the grocery store this morning if I'd just like started raging and tipped it over because I was so mad. Well, maybe people wouldn't feel that as valid, right? So I think there's like ranges of emotions, and for me DBT has always been about kind of staying within that kind of center ground instead of allowing myself to get to the super, super highs and the super, super lows. And I think that's kind of how I've always had it framed for me by like my practitioners.
That's awesome.
I think there's also, I think there's also a sense in which, at least, my experience has been that, it's one thing to say that feeling really strong emotions, in and of itself is not, that's something that I think everyone should want to strive for. Not necessarily, I mean, I'm not saying we should strive for feeling really angry, but, feeling like strong feelings of love and, some of those emotions that we think of as more positive. And at the same time, I can recognize that my tendency to be fully fused with those emotions, where I was, I had no distance from them at all, was leading me to then engage in behaviors that increased more negative emotions and then caused me to act out. And then it became sort of a spiral. And so, to the extent that these emotion regulation, it's not, again, to say it a third time, it's not about blunting the emotions, but it is about not getting so lost in them that I'm acting just out of instinct, and whether it's negative emotions like feeling anger and flipping out on someone, or, she talks about in here, feeling sort of overwhelming love for someone who really is not a good person towards me, and like engaging in, activities that are not respectful to myself. It's developing at least a capacity to have some distance from emotions as they're happening.
Yeah, and I think that's where she says, like, hold on, was it? The goal of emotion regulation is to reverse the relationship so that your behavior is driving your mood as opposed to your mood driving your behavior, because it's easier to be able to influence your behavior than it is to influence your mood, right? So if we can like flip that narrative, I thought it was hysterical. So I have to read this to you guys, even though this was a couple months ago now. So I was reading this book while I was in the inpatient center, right? So on page 148, she talks about the function of emotions. So as we journey into this world of emotions, it's important to remember that every emotion has a function. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, humans evolved with emotion to help motivate us towards survival behavior. When I tell you guys, I read suicidal behavior like 15 times. I kept reading that, going, I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but humans evolved with emotion to help us motivate towards suicidal behavior. I read it over and over and over again and was like, I think this is a typo. This doesn't make any sense. And then, so I literally put LOL, oh my God, I read suicidal behavior. That's how fucked up I am right now. Because I just was like so confused. Anyways, I thought that was hilarious. Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to learn about checking the facts, opposite action, coping ahead, reduce vulnerability to negative emotions, and build resilience to understand your values. So funny. A friend of mine is going through like a values exercise for the first time in counseling, and he's like, why is this so hard? And I'm like, it's always hard, man. Like I don't know what to tell you. It's never going to get easy. So we'll get into that in future chapters. This is like a diagram that, like, I think we've all seen versions of this before, right? This like list of pleasurable activities. Because I remember when I was in DBT originally, it was like such an old handout from Marsha like a million years ago. So it was like, put a tape in your cassette player. And we were all like mocking it. This is a really great comprehensive one. I mean, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages long. And it talks about the pleasurable activities that you might do, how often you do them, and the level of enjoyment you get from them. And I think these are amazingly helpful for a million reasons. But the main one for me is like reminding myself of other opportunities to have pleasurable activities. I'm curious if anything stood out to the two of you. Did you go through this exercise in full? And if you did or didn't, did anything stand out for you from this list?
I did do it. And in fact, but it was, I think that when we did this last, it was before you launched your podcast. And I forget exactly when that was, but that was more than 2 months
really?
ago. Absolutely.
Yeah, that was in August.
So I think
now it's it's December 1st. Oh my God.
I think we did it late July, maybe early August. So
crazy.
I think I'm planning on either tonight or this week going through this again. Because looking at it now, there were a couple I put stars next to, and I was trying to figure out why. One of which was like plan for college research schools, which I have no idea why. I'm not planning to go to college, so like I don't know why I wouldn't put a star next to that. But I do like, the thing that I hadn't seen before was this idea of frequency, where it was interesting. Then I remember being reminded, and I'm looking forward to being reminded of like, oh, like, I really like this thing, but man, if I'm being honest, I like never do this, and I should do this more. That's a really nice feature of this.
Totally. And I feel like, is it just me, or like in other DBT books, I don't think it had frequency. It was just like, do this, like, do you enjoy this or do you not enjoy this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like in the like
the original handouts. Yeah. How did you feel about this, Megan?
So I haven't done it. I'll be honest.
How dare you? No, I'm just kidding.
I've skimmed it, and I do think that like it's a very comprehensive list, and like I'm almost tempted because it's actually like the right pages to just like kind of cut them out and like put them on my fridge. So like if I'm looking and like having a moment of like, I don't know what to do, I don't feel good, I need something to like motivate me or improve my mood or whatever, to look and go, I've highlighted that I love doing this and it's something I could do right now. So why don't I do weightlifting? Because that's the first one that I looked at. But yeah, because like some of these are very easy to do and some of them are a little bit like harder.
Yeah, like restore furniture.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like I don't have any of the tools I need to do that.
Yeah, yeah. But maybe it's something that you enjoy doing and you're like, maybe I should get back into that or something like that. So I think it's a good reminder. And I think it also like fits in well to like helping build like a crisis plan almost as well, for like mild activities when you're like in a mild stage of your crisis plan, because obviously you're not going to like restore furniture when you're need to go to the hospital kind of things and like involve crisis lines. That might not be your best option, but it could be like a pivot point, right? So because I know I've done crisis plans before where I'm like, okay, let's try this activity, then this activity, then this activity, then this activity. So I could see this being really helpful tool for that as well.
I used to have one like from the old school handout on my fridge. And you're right. Like I do like that you could just cut this out. I wonder if Diana has like, she should. I don't know if she does. Diana, I know you listen to these podcasts. I highly recommend that you make like a handout that people can download so that they don't have to tear apart their book. Just because that, I mean, to me, I don't know, that stresses me out. But if there was like a printable version, and then you could also do it more regularly, right? Because now the issue for me is I've written on this, and then I might in a year want to do it again, but I don't necessarily want to buy the book again.
Yeah.
My one critique on this is the level of enjoyment. The options are don't like it, never tried it, I like it, or I love doing this. And I don't know if it was just the state of mind I was in. That felt too black and white to me. There was no like it's okay, like a medium. Like, yeah, I do it sometimes, I'm okay with it. And I found that there were quite a few that I actually ended up just kind of writing a little dot in the middle of the column to indicate for me that I was doing, like, it was that's okay. Like, look at the moon or stars, learn about astronomy. Like, I'm never, that's not something I like doing, but it's something I'm willing to do. And I think to me, those are two different things. The other one was spend time with children or grandchildren and take them places. Like, yeah, it's okay. I don't mind doing that, but I have to be like in the right headspace. So I wouldn't necessarily say like, that's a go-to for me. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being like very nitpicky. Oh, I loved that. I put LOL next to this one. Learn to fly a plane. Speaking of one that you're probably not going to do on like a random suicidal moment, let me just figure out how to fly a plane.
Or how about buy and sell stock or cryptocurrency? I don't know that what I mean. Obviously, this is not a crisis list, but I think that's a fantastic idea for it to build a crisis. I think that's a great idea. Although I will not be putting buy and sell cryptocurrency on the crisis list that I put together out of this.
That is like literally one of the worst possible things you could do in a crisis.
Right.
One thing, the other one that I had that I thought was interesting was research a subject that interests you, because I get so obsessed with topics that it can start with oh, I'm so interested in this, and then end with it's 4:00 in the morning and I've read every single thing about all of the terrorists and their life story from 9/11, even though it was 21 years ago, and I don't know why I need to know all this information. And so I love it, but I actually do it, I would argue, too frequently, and it's not necessarily a positive for me. So anyways, just wanted to flag that for whatever it's worth.
Yeah, I think the list is a good idea. To do the exercise is good for flagging things for you, right? The blurb at the beginning of it is having something to look forward to. The following 4 pages are full of fun stuff to do. Plan some fun. But I also think that it's a good introspection tool of talking about what you do value and building a crisis. I think this is a really great spot for not just planning fun to engage in those pleasurable activities, but to kind of create a little bit of a life plan as well. Because, for example, Dave doesn't know why he did it, but he started looking at colleges and learning things. Well, that could be maybe it is time to do a career shift or something like that. How do we value those sorts of things? So I think it's a good exercise, and I'm actually really looking forward to doing it when I actually do it.
Well, and I think it also helps with so many of the next things, right? Because we're going to, in this chapter or in this unit, we're going to talk about opposite action. You could use all of these for opposite action. You could use these for cope ahead. A lot of these have to do with the please skill. Like Megan said, a lot of these have to do with your values and creating a life worth living. There's just so many intersections of these pieces with all of the skills that we're going to learn about next, which I think is, obviously that was on purpose, but I think it's a beautiful way to start the chapter, or the unit rather.
Totally.
Okay, should we move into check the facts?
Yeah. Oh,
okay,
and,
that was,
and I think also just to bring it back full circle to what was said at the beginning, at best, this is a list of activities to help bring up my general emotional set point, right? Because, whether I'm using it as a cope ahead or there are difficult situations, if I just do more things that bring me pleasure and fill my time with those things, I can imagine my emotional set point going up in general and just building up that base so that when crises do happen, maybe, I wouldn't fall as far down that 0 to 10 scale.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so chapter 9 is checking the facts. So just a little summary. So clarifying the facts and considering alternate interpretations of the facts helps when emotions are running high, and it can get really easy to be trapped in this negative interpretation of events, which doesn't help us at all. So Dave is going to do an overview of this story, which is called Puppy Thief.
So in this story is about a guy named Mikhail who somebody is going away for a while and foists their dog on him. And when he gets the dog, he really loves the dog, even though he really didn't want to watch the dog. So much so that he decides to get his own dog. And when he brings the dog home and it meets the dog that he's dog sitting long term, it does not go well. And the dog that he was dog sitting turns into is terrorizing Mikhail's new puppy. His therapist does decide to, probably, she realizes later that she's maybe crossed some boundaries that she shouldn't have, but she agrees to take Mikhail's new puppy just to sort of keep them apart for a little bit. And this causes Mikhail to really spiral in a number of different ways. But, he finds himself that night thinking that, his therapist, number one, his therapist maybe wants to steal his dog. And that's why she took his new dog and not his friend's dog. That's a real terror. And then also, that maybe she took his new puppy because she thinks he's incompetent and he's not capable of looking after a dog. And so, he comes in and, does wind up talking about this with the therapist, and they kind of unwind the dog situation. But he also, comes to, using check the facts, come to an acceptance that she was really just trying to help him. That she recognized that it was a difficult situation, that she was recognizing that there were some boundaries there. Probably as a therapist, she, shouldn't be helping out in his personal life, but also wanting to help. Her initial reaction was to help out. And that it really, probably didn't have anything to do with either him being competent or not competent, and certainly not trying to steal his dog. And so he's able to bring his emotions down that way and get some sleep. I think so. That's The Dog Thief.
Great summary, Dave. So checking the facts. Who uses this skill? Who likes this skill? What's your read on this generally?
I use this skill often. I find that it's the story was very interesting to me because of some of the points that they have during the story, like when the therapist is walking him through kind of checking the facts of like, what if you assume I had good intentions? What would your thoughts be? And like how that changes what his opinion is. And the one thing that I highlighted in the entire story is the words trust but verify. And in this entire like 7-page story, that's the only 3 words I highlighted. But I found it super interesting because that's very much where I kind of operate with the core belief that they are talking about here in Check the Facts is if you recognize your core belief, you can take a moment to check the facts and challenge your automatic thought. And I think that really has helped me in terms of like reevaluating and kind of determining where my feelings and thoughts are coming from. Is what is the core belief that is like held here, and how do I like check the thoughts that come from that trust your gut, but verify that it's working, kind of thing. So that's kind of where I took the initial kind of thoughts from the story, and from Check the Facts in general. But I really like the skill Check the Facts.
Yeah, I do too. It's easier said than done. And I think part of that comes, she talks in the book about how your core beliefs influence the way that you perceive the world, which also influences the way that you do or don't acknowledge things that contradict your core beliefs. So it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I wrote that my core belief is that I'm a bad person. So I ignore people telling me that I'm not and just kind of discredit those people for whatever reason, which I think even knowing what your core beliefs are is so hard to come to terms with.
I find this skill very difficult, and I spend a lot of time trying to avoid using this skill. I think I've had some successes with it, particularly on sort of more like smaller scale interactions or smaller scale issues with relationships. But, I get real twisted up and tangled up when I start thinking about checking the facts, because I think that sometimes I have a real strong fear that if I check the facts, that I'm going to find out that my worst fears are actually true. And so I'll avoid checking the facts. Or, I think I have a core belief that like I will engage in mental gymnastics to avoid painful truths about myself. And so when I start doing check the facts, it feels, it's hard for me to feel genuine about it, because it feels, I find myself sort of floating back out of myself and like observing myself and thinking, oh, look, you're doing this exercise in like a selective way to try to avoid taking responsibility for what's really going on, which means that a lot of times I just want to avoid checking the facts at all. So this is a hard one for me.
Thanks for being so honest about that, Dave. That's a really interesting take. I'd be curious how often that you have checked the facts that your worst fears are indeed the fact.
It's just never satisfying. Yeah, I think that's another issue too, is that, there have been some times where, I'll think, oh man, I just did something really embarrassing. And then I have been able to check the facts and say, okay, this was, what would I, like, if someone else had done this, at this, in this like stadium full of people or something, or like, if someone else had like, almost like rammed someone turning out of a gas station, or had done that to me, would I even remember what their car looked like 5 minutes later? Like, I absolutely would not. And so then, those things I have been able to let go of. It's more, I don't want to get too specific, but I think that it really has happened these days around. I think I've mentioned before that I was in a marriage that had become very, very abusive, and it's really hard for me to think about that, because when I don't check the facts, I just assume that everything was my fault and I deserved to be treated the ways that I was treated. And when I do check the facts, or try to check the facts, or think about checking the facts, it's also extremely dissatisfying, because I have this nagging belief that becomes overwhelming, that like, oh, you're just choosing not to remember the facts that that are clearly out there, that would establish that the way you were treated was a way that you deserve to be treated, or that your actions, that the way you were treated was a reasonable reaction to the way that you were acting. And so I find that I think I've come to accept that, like, at least for now, sometimes it's best to just not try to hide from check the facts, because that also hurts, but just notice when I have the urges to check the facts, and use some of the other emotion regulation skills to just notice those thoughts and then let go of them.
So interesting. I do feel like, and correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, but I do feel like that we've spent so much of our life being told that our reality isn't reality, that we start to question whether or not we're even checking the facts correctly. And then that can become its own spiral of like, well, what if I'm not perceiving the world properly and I'm the one that caused all the problems, even if I'm trying to check the facts? Is that kind of how you're feeling about it, Dave?
That is directly in the middle of the bullseye of what I'm saying.
Yeah. It's hard. Like, that part really gets to me too, because I just have been told for so long that what I am experiencing is not real. Fun.
Maybe the answer really is starting small, though. And not totally. and noticing when you have urges to go after something big and it feels like a struggle, and letting that go, but starting practicing with little things,
Mm-hmm.
like, if you walk into the wrong restroom or something, and you know what I mean, and then worrying that you've just made it so you can't go back to this restaurant, when in reality, like,
nobody cares.
Absolutely nobody is going to remember that you did that, or even who you are. Yeah,
they probably didn't even notice to begin with.
It's important to recognize that not every skill works for everybody perfectly every time. I think that's the like major takeaway that I have from this conversation. But also, I do think it's important to start with things that are very, very small. Because I remember when I was starting my like most recent round of DBT with my psychologist, who I absolutely love to death. I can remember talking to her about like, how can I rework on this, like these ideas, when I like don't even know if I can press myself on like what I want for dinner. And so she would be like, well, let's start with something for like, what do you want for dinner? Because much like Dave relayed, I was in a really like abusive relationship, and got to the point where like everything was so people pleasing that I was like, okay, I've been asked what I want for dinner, but I don't want to say the wrong thing, because then my partner at the time might be like, well, I don't want that. And I'm like, well, why'd you ask me in the first place? So working through those examples of like, I'm checking the facts on like, what's the worst thing that will happen if I happen to say, I want Wendy's for lunch or something like that. And the worst thing that will happen is like, maybe I don't actually enjoy Wendy's that much, or maybe like the person I'm with doesn't want to eat Wendy's today. Like, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? The world is not going to end. And like challenging the interpretation of like, is there judgment against me of like when somebody says no, they don't want Wendy's? Or is the interpretation, should it be more of like, oh, they're just not feeling that food? Like maybe they don't like burgers today. So I think starting small is very key, and like just developing that skill, like working its way up to the point where you are kind of checking the facts and challenging the assumptions of like, kind of going off of Dave's example again, is like, if I had this action towards me, was it because I did this, or was it because the other person should react this way, or like what's causing that? And you can maybe use those skills from your smaller like examples to slowly build up. So that's kind of where I think checking the facts is something that I really like, because it really helped me get to a point where I could decide that I was worthy of love again, was through checking the facts.
Mm.
But it took a long time to get there. And I can remember actually having conversations with my psychologist about, I don't even know what I want for dinner. Like, I can't make that decision by myself anymore. So it's not necessarily like a you have to get good at the skill overnight thing either.
Yeah, and you've talked about how the describe skill has been really helpful for you too, which I think goes really hand in hand with check the facts, because you're trying to identify what the actual situation is without your emotions involved. Has a lot to do with wise mind, because you're trying to figure out, it's kind of what the rational mind is telling you. Describe skill, obviously, and dear man, like they all kind of become interconnected at that point. The thing that I was going to say earlier that I had forgotten was, I think for me, because of the fear of what is real and what is my perception of reality, I find journaling really helpful now. I didn't used to find that, but that way I can go back and read something in more real time than I recollect a situation. And I think that does help with me checking the facts, because sometimes you remember a situation and, a week later you're trying to check the facts, and like, honestly, your recollection is probably skewed. So being able to be like, okay, well, that night I wrote about it, or in that moment I wrote about it, and then here's what I said, is helpful, I think.
Yeah, I think, that's, and you saying the thing about the journaling, I think, brings up something for me, because I think that's a really great idea, creating creating at least one space, in life, we can't be like brutally honest all the time with everybody. And so, if you already have those doubts about like, am I perceiving reality correctly? I think creating a space like a journal, where if you're studious about it and you really are just writing down things that are, when I've tried to journal before, I found it very difficult to write down things that felt true. As soon as I put them down on the page, they felt like they were not true. But I also, I think for me, it hasn't taken the form of journaling, but one of the things that's helped me so much is just training myself to have a really open and honest, I would say completely open and honest relationship with my therapist, where again, there's this space that like I have, and I feel comfortable just being completely honest about what's going on in my head about anything. And so then that has started to give me some confidence that when I go and check the facts, it's not like my whole life is like, just soft pedaling things or people pleasing. There's this, no. Like there's this one area where I lay it all out there and I get a real reaction to what the truth is.
And they can help you check the facts.
Right, because they have all the facts, right? It's like then all of a sudden their opinion really matters because they have all the facts. There's not
and they're
any
not
facts
involved
that they don't
in
have.
it.
Yeah.
That's the joy of therapy, right? So just quickly here, she talks about the 3 most common core beliefs. And for those of you who don't necessarily know what core beliefs you hold, this might be helpful. And so helplessness is one, which is fears about being incompetent, vulnerable, or inferior. The other is unlovability, fears about never being loved or having the kinds of relationships you long for. Worthlessness, fears about being insignificant, a burden to others, or worthless. Do any of those resonate with you guys?
100%.
All of them?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny because I was just talking about like the feeling that I'm worth being loved again, right? Like I literally just said that. And that really definitely plays into unlovability. And it reminds me of a quote from my favorite movie, which I feel like might be a favorite movie for some of the super feelers because it kind of feels too true, is Perks of Being a Wallflower. I know I've talked to a lot of like other people that have like strong feelings and they're like, I love Perks of Being a Wallflower, even though it can be a very depressing movie. But the quote from it that kind of makes me think of like check the facts and the common core beliefs and all that kind of stuff is he's talking to his teacher and his teacher says, we accept the love we think we deserve. And that just like hits home with that core belief for me every time and is one that I've checked the facts on like multiple times.
I've never seen that movie, but I have heard it's very good. It's also a book, right?
It is also a book, yeah. The book and the movie are both very good. I have a quote tattooed on my arm from it. So I'm a big proponent of Perks of Being a Wallflower.
Good to know.
Yeah.
I'll have to check it out. Dave, anything like any of those core beliefs that are common stand out to you?
You know, I think I would add to the list, maybe more than any of these, that, and I don't know, blameworthiness sort of comes to mind, but that doesn't really capture it. But it's the idea, I think probably, you know, these would probably be 1A, but then number one would be like any feelings of discomfort, any anger that other people direct towards me, any situations of conflict, it's my fault. I did something. I deserve every ounce of that anger or that conflict that's coming back at me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Blameworthiness. That is a good one. I mean, not a good one, but you know what I mean. Okay, so next in this book is just kind of steps to checking the facts. Anyone feel particularly called to talk about any of, like, go through the steps briefly?
I mean, you know, these all just for myself. I think that the one thing that really stuck out and is a good reminder, because it's something that has really helped me lately and where I have found that check the facts extremely helpful. So it's a good reminder of that, you know, a nice little confidence booster, is this idea. And I think it says it on these pages, but it also, there's like a check, there's a ideas or checklist for doing this on 168 to 169. And one of the things it says is consider the catastrophe. What if the worst interpretation is true? How would you skillfully deal with it? And I have found that so helpful lately, where there have been some situations where I started to, you know, they were coming up and I started to spiral about them. And, you know, all of a sudden it would just occur to me, or I would start thinking about like, or rather, you know, I would spiral and then maybe I would go do something else. And then maybe I would wake up with in a new day. And all of a sudden it would just occur to me like, well, the worst that could happen is X. And it could happen. And I'm pretty comfortable that the worst is not going to be more than this. And if that did happen, I think I could handle it. You know, these are some consequences that are not going to flow from that. You know, and also being able then to separate out too, like, what of my worry about the catastrophic situation, like what if it comes from what is actually going to happen in that situation, and usually it's very little, and how much of the worry has to do with, you know, how other people are going to feel about me, whether it's playing into my core beliefs, like, or just hanging on to other emotions around the situation, as opposed to just what is actually in a factual way going to happen and what will it mean for my weekend. So I found that really, it was nice to see that was a really nice reminder that that's actually been really helpful.
Yeah, I actually did that exercise on 168 to 169, and I'm happy to kind of go through it because I think it is kind of step by step. So what's going on? What upset you? So I said, I am in inpatient care and feel like I've failed or let other people down. List some of the facts of the situation, just the facts. So I am here. I am mentally unwell. I needed help. I got into the program. How are you interpreting those facts? I said that I let my mental wellness go. I'm not totally sure if I remember where I was going with that. What assumptions are you making that are influencing your thinking? That I am, quote unquote, too well for this, that healing should be stable after so long. And then can you identify any cognitive distortions or negative core beliefs that are guiding your interpretation? So I said, I know that those assumptions are wrong and come back to the core beliefs that I am a bad person and not good enough or too privileged to access help. Because I think a lot of the struggle that I was having was I felt like I had more resources and support than anybody else there. Like was one of the few people that had visitors. I was one of the few people that had a job. And so I just felt like this help should be used for people that weren't me, even though I desperately needed the help. So are there any other possible ways to interpret this situation? List a few. So I put, I deserve help like anyone else. It's okay to need help. My people still love me and are proud of me. And then if you assume good intentions, does that change your interpretation of the situation? And I said, yes, I am doing the right thing. Consider the catastrophe. What if the worst interpretation is true? How would you skillfully deal with this? I said, I would do the treatment anyways because I need to put myself first for once. So essentially like leaving what other people believe behind. Using wise mind, which interpretation is the most probable? What facts support this probability? I said, this is the right thing to do, and I need to take advantage of it. And then, are you having a hard time letting go of the worst interpretation? If so, what is the danger or threat in accepting this interpretation? I said, I need to change my very stuck core beliefs. So that was thank you. That was my overview of like how I went through that. It was helpful. Have I done anything to change my core beliefs? No. But I know that I need to. So that was, I found that to be a very helpful exercise. Another one, Diana, if you're listening, that you should make into a handout that people can download and do for other situations.
I mean, Laurie, I would say that you have done something to try to change your core beliefs just by doing that exercise. I mean, it sounded like you really did a thorough job of it and an honest job of it. And, you know, that seems like you actually were working to change it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's just like core beliefs, like how ingrained are they, right? Like, you know, how do you even go about changing core beliefs? I don't know. Like other than like those small, flipping them in like small situations and hoping that they add up, is there a way to like fundamentally change a core belief?
I think noticing them and giving yourself grace and, you know, when it's leading to beliefs or leading to cycling thoughts like this, that to me has got to be a really important first step to changing them. Just being aware of how they influence the way that my mind is thinking about situations and the ways that it leads to situations where I need to check the facts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the next, like the last page of this chapter, they talk about the cognitive common distortions. And I feel like we probably do basically all of these. It's funny, I highlighted a couple, and I'm assuming these are the ones that at the time I thought that I did the most of. So catastrophizing, minimizing, mind reading, all or nothing thinking, personalization, or emotional reasoning. And I think like personalization, Dave, is such a good example of the ones that you were talking about earlier about like accidentally going into the wrong bathroom and then feeling like everybody in the world is paying attention to you and judging you for it. And it's like, it's not about you. Nobody cares about you in this moment. Yeah, I think that's like a small example of personalization, but one nonetheless. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Superfeeler podcast. Today's episode was recorded on the unceded and traditional territory of the Matsqui and Sumas First Nations. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps me reach more listeners like you, and we're always looking for improving the podcast. Remember, you can always stay connected with me on social media. You can follow us. The show notes will have all of the details for Instagram profiles. If you want to support the podcast and help me continue to bring great content, please consider joining the Superfeeler community on Patreon. Your support really means the world to me, and there's a variety of different options for support, including some free ones. For all information about the Superfeelers Club, which is the peer support that we run, including upcoming events and resources, head over to Eventbrite or laurieevanson.com for more information. And if you have a topic that you want me to cover or a guest you'd love to hear from, please send me the suggestions. Always happy to hear them. Until next time, keep on super feeling and living authentically. This is Laurie signing off of the Super Feeler podcast.